Processor is the main component on the motherboard and it is called as brain of the computer. The clock rate is one of several factors that can influence the performance. Now there are two chips, that is one is north bridge and one is south bridge. This controller is a circuit which enables the CPU to communicate with hard disk, floppy disk and other kind of disk drive. Dear students, I am Ravi Kumar KR, lecturer in Computer Science, Vidhyaashram PU College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. And today, start our discussion in the session 2. We are going to discuss the components of motherboard. In our session 1, in previous session, we have learned the different technical terms and different parts of the computer system or different parts on the motherboard. And what is a motherboard, by the way? It is a large printed circuit board where many electronic components are mounted on it. Now let us see the different components of the motherboard one by one. Now in this session we are going to discuss about there are three components, that is processor, BIOS as well as CMOS. Now, and what are all the different components available on the motherboard? Here, if you look at the screen here, the main component on the motherboard is the processor. It is also called as CPU. Next, BIOS, CMOS, memory and expansion slot, disk controllers, I/O ports and interface, bus or bus system, SMPS. These are the different important components on the motherboard. Now let us discuss these components one by one. Now you can see the picture here. This is a picture of a motherboard and all different parts are labeled here. And here this is a part called a CPU socket. These are the sockets. And again, this is the CPU fan connectors. And this is slot. This is DIMM memory slots. This is your memory slots and power connectors and IDE connectors and BIOS chip here and south bridge. It is a chipset supporting chip and again PCI slots. These are the slots and PCI Express slots. So these are all different components on the motherboard. Now let us start our discussion with the component, that is processor. Now you can see the picture of processor here. These are the microprocessor or nothing but IC. So microprocessor is the largest IC on the motherboard. What is a processor? And in our previous session we have discussed about the how computer works. So that is, we have explained about the different parts of CPU, that is memory unit, control unit and arithmetic and logic unit. And all the functions what you have learned in previous session is taken care or it takes place inside the processor. So this is called the brain of your computer system. So what is a processor? Processor is the main component on the motherboard and it is called as brain of the computer. It consists CPU or it consists of ALU, memory unit and control unit. See, this is what we have seen in the block diagram of computer system. We have CPU also has the registers. It is also a type of memory fabricated inside the processor. And what are registers? These also registers are temporary storage areas for holding data and instructions. Next, ALU, as you know that it plays or it performs arithmetic and logical operations on the data provided. Next, CPU is fabricated as a single integrated circuit, that is a chip, IC chip, and is known as microprocessor. See, what is a microprocessor? It is a single chip and all these components are mounted inside that as a single microprocessor, single integrated circuit. So this is what we have discussed in block diagram of computer system. Now let us move on to next slide. The microprocessor is a multi-purpose programmable devices that accept digital data as input, process it according to the instructions stored in this memory, and provide result as output. That is what we have discussed yesterday in the previous session. Now we look into what is the processor speed. Now, how can we measure the performance of our CPU or a computer? Now, this is the performance of a computer system is measured with a processor speed. And what is the processor speed? It is number of cycles per second at which CPU of a computer operates and able to process information. Now, what is the processor here? Processor is the one, it executes so many instructions. Okay, so that is the meaning of that. So here, the number of instructions processed by or executed by a microprocessor per second is the measure of the performance of your computer system or the microprocessor. So the processor speed is measured in megahertz and is essential to the ability to run applications. Now we are getting microprocessor with gigahertz speed also. This is another term we use here is clock speed. What is a clock speed? Clock speed is number of instructions can execute in one cycle, and the clock rate is the one of several factors that can influence the performance. I mean, the performance of the computer or the processor is termed or is measured with clock speed, another technical term for the performance of microprocessor. Now let us look into the another component, that is chipset. See, this is one of the chip, one of the integrated circuit, that is IC, and here the chipset, as I told you, a chipset is a combination of 2 or 3 chips, okay, or an integrated circuit to support with the microprocessor, or to communicate with different parts of the computer, or to communicate with different parts on the motherboard or different hardware devices. So here chipset, it needs to be a proper channel or medium for an effective and efficient communication between processor and other component, and this is done by chipset. Chipset is coordinates between different hardware devices on the motherboard for efficient or effective communication. Now if you look at the chipset, now there are 2 chips, that is one is north bridge and one is south bridge. Now you can see in the diagram, in the picture, this is the motherboard where you can see one chip is a north bridge and another is south bridge, and as I told you, it is together we call it as a chipset. And north bridge, it is used to manage data communication between the CPU and motherboard. And if I say CPU, I am talking about all the 3 parts of CPU: memory, control unit, and ALU. So communication inside CPU with the motherboard is taken care of or coordinated with north bridge, and it is responsible for control of high-speed components like CPU, RAM, and video cards. Another type of chipset is called south bridge. It is similar to north bridge or north chipset, and south bridge components are slower as compared to north bridge components. So these south bridge are connected with sound cards, network card, hard disk, and CD-ROM drive, and USB port. So what is the difference between these two? Only communication. Here chipset, it is a combination of 2 chips. One is north bridge as well as south bridge, and north bridge is going to communicate with the devices like components like CPU, RAM, and video cards, and south bridge is going to communicate with the devices like sound cards, network card, and hard disk. So as you compare these two, the communication is more faster here as compared to south bridge. So this is one of the component on the motherboard, that is chipset. Now let us move on to one more component, that is called BIOS. What is BIOS? BIOS is the full form of BIOS is basic input output system. So this is one of the chip on the motherboard. This basic input output system, it is the fundamental purpose of the BIOS are to initialize and test the system hardware components and to load an operating system from a mass memory devices. So what is the BIOS? It is one of the chip on the motherboard. It contains instructions for to initialize and test the hardware devices or hardware components when during booting. And actually when you boot the computer means when you boot the computer or when you switch on the computer first time, the first operation is performed by this BIOS chip. See, whenever you boot the computer, this BIOS, a self-test that is called POST, post, power on self-test. You might have seen when you boot the computer, you can see some display or some messages on the monitor. That is nothing but the self-test, that is POST, power on self-test, carried out by this BIOS chip at the time of booting the computer. So it checks for different types of hardware is connected to this CPU, or is it functioning or not functioning, and also it checks the memory system or computer memory, how much the memory is available for this operation. So this is one of the function of BIOS. BIOS is a small chip on the motherboard, and BIOS software is stored on a non-volatile ROM chip on the motherboard on the system. In modern computer, the BIOS contents are stored as a flash memory chip. It is in the nowadays we can see the BIOS chip as a flash memory, and this allows BIOS software to be easily upgraded to add a new features or fix bugs, but can make the computers vulnerable to BIOS. This is the function of BIOS. BIOS is a small chip on the motherboard, and inside that are the BIOS chips are programmed in such a way that so that it, as soon as you boot the computer, it will be activated and initializes all hardware system and different components on the motherboard, and also loads the operating system from the memory devices. So this is BIOS. Now, and also if you look at the diagram here, the picture here, you can see that this type of screen. This is an example for BIOS CMOS setup or BIOS setup. This is the way we can configure BIOS settings of the computer system. Now let us move on to next slide, and it is CMOS. CMOS is another component on the motherboard, that is CMOS. It stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. You can see the diagram here. This is CMOS chip, and it is supported with a lithium battery. And here, what is a CMOS here? It is complementary metal oxide semiconductor, and it is describes a small amount of memory on a computer motherboard that stores the BIOS settings. CMOS also contains the information about your system date and time. It is the one, it holds the system date and time, and this CMOS is usually powered by a cell battery. See, this is what I'm talking about. This is a lithium battery. So this chip, the CMOS chip, is powered by lithium battery. And here, incorrect or slow system date and time and loss of BIOS settings are major signs of dead or dying CMOS battery. So if at all any problem with your CMOS settings or BIOS setting, it is one of the reason is that this battery, this is lithium battery, may be weak. So we may have to replace that CMOS battery. Now let us start with slots. Slots is an opening in a computer system where we can insert a PCB or printed circuit board. Now we can see the diagram here. These are the example for different type of slots. And here in this example, you can see expansion slots, and these are called memory slots. Here, these are the memory slots where we are going to insert RAM or RAM chip. And this is storage device connectors. These are all different types of slots. And generally, a slots is nothing but an opening where we are going to connect different PCB or different hardware so that it increase the performance of your CPU or computer, or we can increase the capabilities of computer system by connecting external devices through slots. Now let us see different types of slots. Here, one of the slots is ISA, industry standard architecture. See, in this table you can see different types of slots, and this IS slot used to connect modem and IO devices or input devices. Next one is PCI, peripheral component interface, where you're going to connect this sound cards, internal modem, etc. And AGP, accelerated graphic port, and this is designed for attaching a video card to your computer system. And RAM slot, it is to install computer memory. Processor slot, it is what you have learned in our first session. Processor socket, it is processor slot, it is to insert processor chip. And PCI expansion slot, this is to connect hardware components such as network card, modems, and sound cards. And another type of slot is PC card or personal computer card, where we are using to connect for Wi-Fi card, network card, and external modem. See, these are all different types of slots available on the motherboard. And another type of component is disk controllers. What are disk controllers? The disk controllers is a circuit which enables the CPU to communicate with hard disk, floppy disk, and other kind of disk drives. So disk controllers are responsible for a communication between hard disk as well as floppy disk or different types of disk. Next one is disk controllers. One is hard disk controller interface that enables the computer to read and write information to the hard drive. And this is floppy disk controller, FDC. It is for controls reading and writing to a computer's floppy disk drive. Again, look at the diagram here. These two where we are connecting hardware, that is hard disk or floppy disk drive, to the system. Next one is IO ports and interfaces. Here IO stands for input, output ports and interfaces. An IO interface is required whenever the IO devices is driven by the processor, and the processor can communicate with IO devices through this interface, that is IO device and interface. Now, if you look at the rear part of your CPU or rear side of your CPU, you can find one card like this. This is generally we get one card, and here we can see different types of interfaces and ports. If you look into that, here you can find a small blue color one, that is VGA card or VGA port. We say VGA port. Normally we are connecting the computer monitor to this port. And here you can see here serial port. It is small, it will be of 9-pin connectors, serial port, where we are connecting the devices like mouse as well as modem. It is another name of serial port is COM port or communication port. Similarly, you can see this is this color one. This is called parallel port. This is another type of interface, parallel port, where we are connecting devices like printers or scanners, etc. See, if you look at this IO port and card, it is a single card where all the different ports are fabricated into one. And apart from this, you can also see this USB ports available here, USB ports, and this is Ethernet card, or we say where we are going to connect NIC, the network interface card, NIC card to this through a connector RJ45. It is an interface. So this is the meaning of IO ports and interfaces available on the motherboard. So it is going to help us to connect different hardware devices to different connectors, different interfaces. And the main purpose of this is communication with IO devices through this interface. This is input-output interface. Now, you can see here another diagram here where you can see the different interfaces here, different interface. This is another diagram, which is USB interface. You can see that where we connect different devices. Now, we can see the definitions and specification of different ports available on the IO card. that is serial port. It is known as COM port, where we are using this for connecting modems as well as keyboard or mouse, and it is a 9-pin connector or 25-pin ports. Now, next one is parallel port. It is to connect external devices, I/O devices like printers or scanners, and it comes with 25-pin connectors. And next one is IDE. This is integrated digital electronics port. Here we are going to CD-ROM drives, hard disk drives are connected to the motherboard through this IDE port. So these are the specification of different I/O ports. Again, the same diagram here. This is VGA as well as COM port, and it is parallel port, and this is USB as well as you can say the Ethernet port, that is to connect NIC, network interface card. And again, another types of ports, USB port, full form is Universal Serial Bus. Now all of you are familiar with USB. Now most of the hardware devices nowadays comes with USB interface. So USB is a plug and play devices. Here plug and play interface between a computer and the add-on devices. And it gives easy to use connector to variety of peripherals. What are peripherals? And the hardware devices which goes into CPU or which you can able to connect to the CPU are called computer peripherals. So nowadays most of the computer peripherals having USB interface. Now it includes printers, scanners, etc. It supports data speed of 12 megabits per second. Next one is PS2 ports. PS2 is personal system port. It is used to interface keyboards and point devices like mouse and touchpads. It uses synchronous serial signals to communicate between the keyboard and mouse. That is a type of communication. Now this is AGP, accelerated graphic port, used to connect graphic card, and it provides a high-speed video performance required in games as well as other multimedia applications. Let us move on to the next slide where it shows the same different ports and interfaces. Then another type of ports, that is SCSI, small computer system interface. It used to add external devices such as hard disk, CD-ROM, etc. And here the communication or data transfer is fast as compared to other ports. And next one is VGA. This is visual graphic adapter. It can monitor to the computer's video card. It has 15 pins or 15 holes. Next one is power connector. Computer, it has to be powered by electricity. So it has a power connector. It is 3-pronged pin. Means say the 3-pin connectors. It connects to the computer's power cable. This is power connector. Then firewall port. It transfers large amount of data at very high speed. It connects video equipment to the computer, and data travel at 400-800 megabits per second. So it comes with 4-pin and connectors, 6-pin and 9-pin connectors. So these are all additional or different I/O ports available on the motherboard. And again, modem port. This modem, we are using again COM port here or serial port to connect modem to the computer system. Next one, Ethernet port. As I told you, it is to connect network cable to the CPU, to the motherboard, that is Ethernet port. And again, game port, connect PC to a joystick like devices. And DVI port, that is digital video interface. It connects LCD monitors to the computers. And sockets. And here we can find sockets. It used to connect microphone, speakers to sound card of the computers. And again, MIDI, that is musical instrument digital interface. It supports designed to transmit information between electronic musical instruments. Thank you very much.